The morning sun shone brightly over the headquarters of Crane Agritech, one of the biggest agricultural companies in the country. The building, tall and made of glass, looked like a giant mirror reflecting the busy city around it. Inside, people were rushing through hallways, their shoes clicking against the polished floor, carrying files, laptops, and cups of coffee. It was not an ordinary day. The company's CEO, Richard Crane, was preparing for an important investor visit that could bring in millions of dollars in new funding. Everything had to look perfect. In the main production hall, a massive high-tech soil analysis machine stood at the center. It was the pride of Crane Agritech, a complex piece of engineering designed to test soil quality, moisture levels, and crop health within minutes. The machine was huge, shining silver and humming quietly as lights blinked across its control panel. It had never failed before, and until today, just an hour before the investors were supposed to arrive, something went wrong. The humming stopped. The lights flickered once, then went dark. The control screen flashed a red warning sign: system failure. The entire production floor froze. A technician named Michael tapped on the screen nervously. "That can't be right," he muttered. Another engineer hurried over, typing commands, but the machine stayed silent. Within minutes, the news spread across the floor. The main demonstration machine had broken down. When Richard Crane walked in, his sharp suit and polished shoes caught the light. His face showed no emotion at first, but the tension in his jaw was clear. He was a man used to control, and control was slipping away. "What's going on?" he demanded, his deep voice cutting through the panic. Michael stammered, "Sir, it just stopped responding. We've tried restarting it, but nothing's working." Richard's brows tightened. "Nothing's working?" He took a step closer, looking over the engineer's shoulder. "Do you realize investors are coming in 45 minutes? This machine is worth $500,000, and you're telling me it's dead?" The technicians exchanged nervous glances. Sweat dripped from Michael's forehead. "We're trying, sir. It could be a power surge or a wiring issue." "Could be," Richard snapped. "I don't pay for guesses, Michael. I pay for solutions." His voice echoed across the metal walls. The room went silent. Everyone knew better than to speak when the CEO was angry. Richard turned to the head engineer. "Get your best people on this. I don't care if you have to take it apart piece by piece and make it work again." The head engineer nodded quickly. "Yes, sir." He ran off, calling for more help, but no one could fix it. The minutes dragged on. The investors' cars were already approaching the building, and the once busy floor now felt like a battlefield after a disaster. Workers whispered in corners. Some blamed faulty software, others said it was overheating. Nothing made sense. Richard paced near the machine, checking his watch every few seconds. He could feel the pressure building inside him like boiling steam. He had built this company from nothing, a man who believed every problem had a solution if you threw enough money or intelligence at it. But now, for the first time in years, he felt helpless. Outside, a delivery truck pulled up near the loading dock. A local farmer had sent a batch of fresh organic produce for the company cafeteria, part of a partnership program to support local growers. Among the farmers unloading the truck was Samuel Carter, a tall man with strong hands and calm eyes. His teenage son, Noah, helped him carry baskets of vegetables. Noah was quiet but observant. He loved machines, tractors, engines, anything that moved or hummed with life. He often helped his father repair farm tools back home, learning how things worked by taking them apart. When they entered the building, Noah's eyes widened at the sight of all the technology around him. Screens, sensors, wires, flashing lights. It was a world far away from the open fields he knew. As they passed the production hall, they heard raised voices. Richard Crane's tone was sharp and frustrated. "We're running out of time. Somebody fix this before I lose my patience." Noah glanced inside. The huge silver machine stood silent, surrounded by grown men scratching their heads. He watched for a moment, then said softly to his father, "I think the problem's in the cooling chamber." Samuel looked at him in surprise. "What did you say?" "The noise," Noah said, pointing. "Before it stopped, it must have made a clicking sound. That usually means the temperature sensors aren't talking to the main board." "It's not dead, it's locked." Samuel smiled faintly. "You and your machines," he said with a shake of his head. Inside the hall, the frustration grew. An engineer accidentally dropped a tool, and Richard slammed his hand against the machine in anger. "Useless, all of you." He shouted, "Does anyone here actually know what they're doing?" There was silence. Then from the doorway a quiet voice said, "I might." Everyone turned. There stood Noah, the farmer's son, his hands still dusty from unloading vegetables. His voice was calm but confident. Richard blinked, confused. "Who are you?" "Noah Carter," the boy replied. "I think I know what's wrong with your machine." Laughter rippled through the room. One of the technicians smirked. "Kid, this isn't a tractor. It's a $500,000 analyzer." Noah didn't flinch. "I know, but it's still a machine. And machines all talk the same language if you listen." Richard's eyes narrowed, both annoyed and intrigued. "Fine," he said sarcastically. "Since my experts can't fix it, let's see what the farmer's kid can do. You've got 5 minutes before the investors walk in. Don't make a fool of yourself." Noah walked forward slowly, his heart pounding but his hands steady. He touched the side of the machine, listening for a faint vibration. The room watched in disbelief as the boy began examining the panels with precision that seemed beyond his age. He pressed a few buttons, checked a circuit, then said quietly, "You overloaded the backup power module." The system shut itself down to protect the wiring. He reached into a small toolbox near the engineers, borrowed a screwdriver, and began adjusting something inside the control board. Sparks flickered. For a moment, everyone held their breath. Then the machine let out a soft hum. The lights came back on. Richard Crane froze. The giant screen blinked to life with a single line of text. "System restart successful." The machine was working again, and standing beside it, covered in dust, but wearing a small, knowing smile, was a farmer's child who had just done what none of the CEO's engineers could. It was only the beginning of a story that would soon shake everyone in that building, especially Richard Crane. The meeting room buzzed with nervous energy as the investors arrived, their polished shoes echoing on the marble floor. Everyone smiled, pretending nothing had gone wrong, while deep down the panic still lingered. The massive machine, now mysteriously fixed, hummed softly in the background as if nothing had ever happened. But one man couldn't shake his curiosity. Richard Crane, the CEO himself. He wanted to know who had brought it back to life. He wanted to see the face behind that unexpected miracle. After the investors were escorted out for a short coffee break, Richard turned sharply to his staff. "Who fixed it?" he demanded. The engineers exchanged glances. Finally, one of them, nervous and pale, said, "Sir, it was that boy." "The farmer's kid," Richard frowned. "A boy?" "Yes, sir. He just walked in and did it. We thought he was one of the delivery helpers." Richard didn't respond at first. He just stared at the machine, the smooth steel reflecting the morning light. "Bring him to me," he said quietly. "Now." Moments later, a young boy stepped into the CEO's office, Noah Carter. His boots were still dusty, his hands slightly greasy from the repair. He looked around at the luxurious room, the leather chairs, the framed awards, and the man behind the desk who seemed to own the world. Noah stood tall, though his eyes held humility. Richard Crane leaned back in his chair, studying the boy. "So," he said slowly, "you're the mechanic everyone's talking about?" Noah shook his head modestly. "I'm not a mechanic, sir. I just like fixing things." That answer amused Richard. "Just like fixing things? You expect me to believe you brought a $500,000 prototype back to life by liking to fix things?" Noah shrugged. "Machines are like people, sir. They talk when something's wrong. You just have to listen close enough." For a moment, Richard didn't know what to say. He had met engineers with PhDs who couldn't describe technology that simply, or that truthfully. The boy wasn't arrogant, wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was just certain. Richard gestured toward a chair. "Sit down, son." Noah obeyed quietly. The CEO leaned forward. "Where did you learn to do that?" "Your school teach you advanced circuitry?" Noah shook his head. "No, sir. I learn at home. My dad teaches me. He builds machines on our farm." Richard chuckled, half mocking. "On a farm? You mean tractors and plows, right? I doubt your father knows much about tech this advanced." There was no anger in Noah's voice when he replied. "He knows more than most people think." The CEO's smirk faded slightly. Something about the boy's calm tone unsettled him. He expected arrogance or fear, but this child spoke with quiet confidence. Richard changed the subject. "So what were you doing here today?" My father and I came to deliver vegetables to your cafeteria, Noah said. He's waiting outside by the truck. The CEO raised an eyebrow. So you're a farmer's kid who walked in here and fixed a machine my engineers couldn't. That's quite the story. Noah didn't respond. He simply looked at the machine through the glass window, watching its lights blink steadily. It was just locked, he said. The system shut itself down to prevent overheating. Whoever built it, they designed it well. Richard tilted his head, curious. You talk like someone who knows design. Noah smiled faintly. My father designs things too. There was something in the boy's eyes when he said that. Pride, but also a hint of mystery. Richard noticed it but didn't press further. He was used to dealing with people who wanted something from him. Money, fame, approval. But this boy wanted nothing. And somehow that made him even more interesting. He stood up, straightened his jacket, and said, You know, son, you've got talent. Maybe you should think about working for me someday. Noah looked down, thoughtful. My father says work should mean more than money. Richard chuckled again, though this time it was softer. Your father sounds like a philosopher. No, Noah said quietly. He's a builder. He builds things people forget how to build, things that last. The CEO felt something strange stir inside him, a mix of irritation and respect. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by a boy in worn-out clothes. But before he could ask more, a knock came at the door. Sir, one of the assistants said, the farmer, the boy's father's, is here to collect him. Send him in, Richard replied, still curious. The door opened and a tall man with weathered hands and wise eyes stepped in. He wore a simple shirt and jeans, but something about his presence filled the room with quiet strength. Richard Crane looked up, and for a brief moment his confident expression faltered. The man seemed familiar. Samuel Carter extended his hand politely. Good morning, Mr. Crane, I'm Noah's father. Richard hesitated, shaking his hand. So you're the one raising little geniuses, huh? Samuel smiled faintly. I just teach my son to listen, to people, to machines, to life. As he spoke, Richard felt a strange unease. There was something about this man's voice, calm but commanding, familiar yet distant. He couldn't place it, but it tugged at a memory buried years deep. Before Richard could ask anything more, Samuel turned to his son. Ready, Noah? Yes, sir, the boy replied. As they left the office, Richard stood by the window watching them walk out toward the loading dock. The sight of that man when the boy who had fixed what his entire team couldn't stirred something old and uncomfortable in him. He didn't know yet that the farmer he'd just met was the same man whose invention he had stolen years ago, the very foundation of his company's success. And he had no idea that fate had just brought Samuel Carter back, not for revenge, but for a reckoning that would test the limits of pride, truth, and redemption. The next morning, the air in the factory was thick with whispers. Everyone was talking about the mysterious boy who had fixed the $1 million machine that no one else could. Some called it luck, others called it genius. But deep down, everyone knew there was something special about that child. Richard Crane, the CEO, couldn't shake the image of Noah from his mind. The boy's calm confidence had left a strange mark on him. He had spent his whole career surrounded by people who tried to impress him, people who bowed, agreed, and flattered. But Noah wasn't like that. The boy had looked him in the eye, spoken simply, and made him feel something he hadn't felt in years, respect without power. Later that day, Richard found himself walking toward the factory floor, his expensive shoes echoing on the cold metal tiles. He rarely came down there. The factory was where the noise lived, where machines whirred and people sweated. But this time he came willingly, searching for the boy who had unknowingly challenged everything he thought he knew about intelligence. When he spotted Noah again, the boy was standing near the same machine, watching it work as if it were alive. His small hands moved with curiosity, tracing the rhythm of the gears. Richard stopped a few feet away, quietly observing. The boy didn't notice him at first. He was too lost in his fascination. You really like machines, don't you? Richard finally said. Noah turned around quickly, surprised but not nervous. Yes, sir. Machines don't lie. When they stop working, they tell you why. Richard smiled faintly. That's a rare way of looking at it. Most people just call the maintenance team and complain. The boy gave a shy grin. Maybe they don't listen long enough. Richard folded his arms. Tell me something, Noah. How old are you? 12, sir. 12, Richard repeated, amazed. At 12, I could barely fix my own bicycle. How did you learn all this? My father teaches me everything, Noah said proudly. He says every broken thing has a story. That simple line hit Richard harder than he expected. Every broken thing has a story. It echoed in his mind like a whisper from his past, one he had long tried to forget. You and your father must be close, Richard said, trying to keep his tone casual. We are, Noah replied. He used to build machines for big companies before we moved to the farm. He doesn't like the city anymore. Says it takes more than it gives. Richard froze. His heart skipped a beat. Your father used to build machines for companies? Yes, sir, Noah nodded. He said he stopped after one of his designs was stolen by a rich company owner. He never told me the name. Richard's throat went dry. He forced a laugh, but it sounded hollow. That must have been tough for him. Noah shrugged gently. He doesn't stay angry. He just builds better things now. The boy's words cut deeper than any insult could. Richard turned away, pretending to admire the machinery, but his mind was racing. The memory he'd buried years ago began to surface. A small workshop in the countryside, a humble man showing him blueprints, and a handshake deal Richard never honored. Could it be? Could that man be Noah's father? He tried to shake off the thought, but fate wasn't done yet. The factory supervisor approached them. Mr. Crane, sir, he said respectfully. The farmer who delivered yesterday's shipment is here again. Says he's waiting for his son. Richard's pulse quickened. He looked at Noah. Your father's here again? Yes, sir, Noah said. He's picking me up. Bring him here, Richard said quietly to the supervisor. I'd like to have a word. Moments later, the door opened and Samuel Carter walked in. Calm, steady, with the same quiet power as before. Richard felt his chest tighten. Their eyes met, and in that instant time seemed to stop. It was him. The same man he had once underestimated. The same man whose idea had made Richard Crane Industries what it was today. Mr. Crane, Samuel greeted politely, as if nothing had ever happened. You wanted to see me? Richard cleared his throat, trying to steady his voice. Yes. I wanted to thank you for allowing your son to help us yesterday. He's remarkable. Samuel smiled slightly. He has a curious mind. I just give him room to grow. Richard nodded, struggling to meet his eyes. He felt an old shame creeping up his spine. The man he'd wronged years ago was standing in his office, calm and unbothered, as if forgiveness were already given without words. I've heard you used to work with machines, Richard said carefully. You ever think of coming back to the industry? Samuel's expression softened. No, Mr. Crane, I've learned that sometimes walking away is better than fighting to stay. Some lessons are meant to be learned the hard way, for both sides. Those last words hit Richard like a silent thunderclap. There was no anger in them, no accusation, only truth. As Samuel turned to leave with his son, Richard watched them go, his thoughts tangled in guilt and admiration. The boy, innocent and bright, had unknowingly reconnected two worlds that once tore apart. For the first time in years, the powerful CEO didn't feel powerful at all. He felt small and strangely grateful. What he didn't realize yet was that this meeting was just the beginning. Fate had given him another chance, a chance to face the man he had wronged, and to prove whether his success was built on greed or growth. Because sometimes, redemption doesn't come from apologies, it comes from the courage to change before it's too late. That night, Richard Crane sat alone in his office long after everyone had left. The city lights flickered outside the glass walls, but he barely noticed them. His thoughts were somewhere else, far back in the past, in a dusty little workshop that smelled of oil, wood, and truth. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, though it didn't calm him. The words from earlier, "Some lessons are meant to be learned the hard way," echoed in his mind again and again. Samuel Carter. That name used to mean nothing more than a line on a contract, a signature that helped to launch his company. But now it carried the weight of guilt he had spent years pretending didn't exist. He remembered the day it all began. Years ago, when Crane Industries was just a struggling startup, he had met Samuel in a small town. Samuel was a farmer with an inventor's mind, quiet, honest, and brilliant. He had designed a machine that could revolutionize agricultural production, one that could change everything for small farmers. Richard had seen potential and profit. Samuel had trusted him. He'd shown him his designs, shared his blueprints, and even said, "This machine isn't just about business. It's about giving back dignity to people who work the hardest." Richard had smiled then, pretending to share the vision, but deep down, he saw only dollar signs. Weeks later, Richard registered the design under his own company name, cut Samuel out completely, and released the invention as Crane Industries' first success. The machine took the world by storm. Investors flooded in. Within a year, Richard Crane became a millionaire, and Samuel Carter disappeared. Now, decades later, Samuel's son had walked into his factory, a boy with the same calm eyes, the same quiet confidence, and the same unshakable intelligence. It felt like fate was forcing him to face what he had buried. Richard rubbed his temples, his chest tightening with a guilt he could no longer ignore. He thought of Noah's words, "Machines don't lie." Maybe that's what haunted him most, that everything he'd built on lies was finally starting to break. The next morning, he arrived at the factory earlier than usual. The sun had barely risen. Workers were surprised to see him walking through the corridor so quietly, not shouting orders or checking profits. He walked to the same machine Noah had fixed, the one that had triggered all of this, and just stood there. He touched the metal surface. It was warm, alive with the hum of energy. "You built this," he whispered. Not to the machine, but to the man who had taught a child how to listen. He couldn't stop thinking about how Samuel had looked at him, calm, kind, and completely unshaken. No bitterness, no revenge, just peace. That made it worse somehow. If Samuel had yelled, accused, or cursed, Richard could have justified it. But he didn't. He just forgave silently, and that forgiveness cut deeper than any hatred ever could. At that moment, Richard realized he couldn't keep pretending. He couldn't build more success on stolen dreams. He needed to set things right. Later that day, he called his assistant. "Get me Samuel Carter's address," he said. The assistant blinked, surprised. "Sir, you mean the farmer?" "Yes," Richard said firmly. "The farmer." He spent hours sitting in his car outside the Carter family's small farmhouse. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in gold and orange. Through the window, he could see Samuel working with his son, teaching him how to weld a piece of old metal into a new part. They laughed together, surrounded by broken tools and unfinished projects, but their faces were peaceful. That sight, that simple, honest happiness, felt like a mirror to everything he'd lost chasing success. He thought of his empty mansion, his cold dinners, his silent phone. He had built an empire, but somewhere along the way he had lost himself. When Samuel finally noticed him outside, he didn't look surprised. He simply wiped his hands, nodded to Noah, and walked toward the car. Richard stepped out, his heart pounding. "Mr. Carter," he began, voice low. "I owe you an apology, and the truth." Samuel's eyes were calm as ever. "You don't owe me, Mr. Crane," he said quietly. "You owe it to yourself." Richard swallowed hard. "I took what was yours. Your design, your idea, your dream. I built my entire company on something I stole." Samuel looked at him for a long moment, then said softly, "You didn't steal my dream, Richard. You stole your peace." That sentence shattered something inside him. For the first time in years, Richard felt his eyes burn. "I want to make it right," he said desperately. "Let me repay you in anything you ask. Money, land, shares." Samuel shook his head gently. "I don't need your money. I just wanted my son to see that no matter what people take from you, they can't take your integrity." Behind him, Noah watched, trying to understand the quiet tension between the two men. He didn't know the full story yet, but he could sense something deep passing between them, something old, broken, and finally beginning to heal. Richard lowered his gaze, ashamed. "Your son is brilliant. He's going to change the world." Samuel smiled faintly. "He will, because he's learning what you never did." Richard looked up. "What's that?" "That success means nothing without honesty." Those words settled heavy in the evening air. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then Richard extended his hand, not as a CEO, but as a man seeking forgiveness. Samuel hesitated, then took it. And just like that, the past began to heal. As Richard drove away from the farm that night, he looked back one last time at the small house glowing under the stars. Inside that home lived something he had spent his entire life chasing but never found. Peace, purpose, and love. And though the road ahead would be long, for the first time in decades, Richard Crane finally knew where it began. The next morning, the sun rose over the city like a second chance. Richard Crane hadn't slept all night. The words Samuel had said kept echoing in his mind. "You didn't steal my dream, Richard. You stole your peace." He had built everything a man could want: money, respect, power, but not peace. That had been missing all along, and now he knew what he had to do. He called an emergency meeting with his board of directors. When his executives arrived, they expected another corporate speech about profits and production. Instead, Richard stood by the window looking nothing like the proud CEO they were used to. His voice was calm but heavy with purpose. "I started this company on a lie," he said. The room went dead silent. "Years ago, I took an idea that didn't belong to me. It belonged to a man named Samuel Carter, a farmer, an inventor, a man more honest than I've ever been. And now I'm going to make it right." The board members exchanged shocked looks. One finally spoke up. "Sir, are you saying you're giving credit to an outsider? That's bad for our image." Richard turned, his eyes cold but steady. "Our image has been built on someone else's sacrifice. If that's bad for business, so be it. I'm done hiding behind success that isn't mine." He dismissed the meeting before anyone could argue further. For the first time, his conscience felt lighter. He knew what had to come next. An offer not made out of guilt, but respect. A few days later, Richard drove back to the countryside, this time not as a CEO, but as a man trying to fix the damage he caused. The drive felt longer than before. His heart raced with every mile, unsure if Samuel would even open the door, but he had to try. When he arrived at the Carter farm, he found Noah sitting on the porch fixing an old radio with quiet focus. The boy looked up and smiled politely. "Hello, sir. Dad's out back." Richard smiled back, humbled by the boy's kindness. "Thank you, Noah. You're just like him, you know, your father." Noah tilted his head, curious. "People tell me that a lot." Richard walked around the house and found Samuel repairing an old tractor under a tree. The man looked up, surprised but not angry. "Mr. Crane," he said, standing slowly. "Didn't expect to see you again so soon." Richard took a deep breath. "I didn't come to apologize this time," he said. "I came to make things right." Samuel wiped his hands, waiting silently. "I've told my board the truth. They know who created the original design. I'm publicly restoring your name as the inventor, the man who built the foundation of Crane Industries." Samuel looked at him, expression unreadable. "That's a bold move, Richard, but you don't need to do that for me." "I'm not doing it for you," Richard said. "I'm doing it because it's the only way I can live with myself." He paused, his voice softening. "But that's not all. I want to offer you partnership in the company, 50-50. You and I equal." Samuel's eyebrows lifted slightly. "After all these years, you want to share what's already built?" Richard nodded. "No, I want to rebuild it, the right way this time, together." There was a long silence. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying the faint sound of Noah humming from the porch. Finally, Samuel said, "You've changed, Richard." Richard smiled faintly. "Maybe, or maybe I just finally listened." Samuel looked down at his rough, calloused hands. "You think people will believe you? The great Richard Crane, admitting he was wrong?" "They already know I was," Richard replied. "Now they'll know I'm human." For the first time, Samuel's stern face softened. "You've done what few men have the courage to do. But partnership? That's a big step." "I'm not asking for your forgiveness anymore," Richard said quietly. "I'm asking for a chance to honor the man who built the dream I stole." Samuel studied him for a long moment, then smiled slightly. "Let me think about it," Richard nodded. "Take all the time you need. I'll wait." As he turned to leave, Noah ran up holding the radio he had just fixed. "Dad, look! It works again." The old radio crackled to life, playing a soft tune from decades ago. Samuel and Richard both froze. It was the same song that used to play in that small workshop all those years ago, when Samuel first showed him the machine. The moment was wordless, heavy with meaning. It was as if the universe itself was giving them a sign, a reminder that broken things could work again, if someone cared enough to fix them. Richard smiled and placed a gentle hand on Noah's shoulder. "You've got your father's gift," he said softly. "Don't ever lose it." As he drove away, he glanced in the rearview mirror, the farm growing smaller behind him, but his heart feeling strangely full. He knew Samuel would take time to decide, but deep down he sensed something had shifted. The past had been faced, and forgiveness was no longer just a word. It was turning into action. And for the first time, Richard Crane didn't feel like a man haunted by his past. He felt like a man finally building a future worth believing in. Days passed quietly after that unexpected visit. Samuel Carter went about his work as usual, fixing old engines, tending his crops, and teaching Noah small lessons about patience and persistence. Yet in the still moments when the wind carried the sound of the wheat brushing against the barn, he found his thoughts drifting back to Richard Crane's words. A partnership. It wasn't the offer itself that puzzled him, it was the tone in Richard's voice. There had been no greed, no pride, no hidden agenda. Just honesty. It had been years since Samuel had seen that look in the man's eyes, the look of someone trying to make peace with his own soul, and somehow that sincerity struck deeper than anger ever could. One evening, Samuel sat on the porch with Noah, the sun melting into orange behind the hills. "Dad," Noah asked, his curious eyes gleaming, "are you going to work with that man again?" Samuel smiled faintly. "I don't know, son. Sometimes doing the right thing doesn't mean doing the easy thing. But you always said fixing something is better than throwing it away," Noah replied innocently. Samuel looked at his son and laughed softly. "You've been listening too well." That night Samuel couldn't sleep. His mind replayed the years of hardship, the nights he spent sketching his invention by lamplight, the moment it was stolen, and the quiet pain of watching another man grow rich off his idea. Yet now that same man wanted to rebuild, to make things right. Maybe this was more than just business. Maybe it was life giving him one last test to forgive and create again. The next morning, Samuel made his choice. When he arrived at Crane Industries, Richard was already waiting, pacing nervously in his office. The moment Samuel walked in, Richard stood straight like a soldier facing judgment. "You came," he said quietly. Samuel nodded. "You said you wanted to build something honest. Let's see if you mean it." Richard's relief was almost visible. "I do, more than ever." And so began what the newspapers would later call the Redemption Project. Together, Samuel and Richard worked on a new design, one that would change modern farming forever. Unlike before, this machine wasn't meant for massive corporations or wealthy landowners. It was designed for small farmers, the kind of people Samuel had always wanted to help. The project brought out the best in both men. Richard brought his experience, funding, and business reach. Samuel brought creativity, innovation, and a deep understanding of the people who worked the land. And between them, Noah became the bridge, a bright young mind absorbing every detail, watching two men rebuild trust one idea at a time. Weeks turned into months. The new prototype began to take shape, a sleek, self-powered farming system that could run on renewable energy, low-cost maintenance, and smart sensors. It was everything Samuel had dreamed of years ago, but now it was even better. One afternoon, as they tested the machine in an open field, something remarkable happened. The machine roared to life, moving smoothly across the soil, planting seeds in perfect rhythm. Workers clapped. Engineers cheered. And Samuel just stood there silently, tears in his eyes. Richard placed a hand on his shoulder. "It's yours this time," he said softly. Samuel turned to him, a genuine smile spreading across his face. "No," he said. "It's ours." That night, a small celebration took place at the farm. For the first time, laughter filled the old wooden barn that once held only memories of loss. The workers danced, Noah beamed with pride, and Richard stood quietly in the corner, feeling something he hadn't felt in years: belonging. When the stars came out, Samuel raised a glass of homemade cider and said, "To second chances, not just for machines, but for people too." Richard smiled. "And for peace," he added. Samuel nodded. "Yes, for peace." As the firelight flickered, Noah looked at the two men who had once been enemies but now stood side by side. In that moment, he understood something powerful: that forgiveness could rebuild what anger had destroyed, and that redemption wasn't about undoing the past, but creating a better future from it. The Redemption Project didn't just fix a machine, it fixed hearts. And from that night onward, Crane and Carter were no longer names separated by betrayal. They became symbols of unity, proof that even broken stories can end beautifully when truth and humility take the lead. Months passed, and the world began to take notice. Newspapers started running headlines like, "Rivals turn partners, the Redemption Project changing farming forever." For the first time, both names appeared side by side, Richard Crane and Samuel Carter. No lawsuits, no rivalry, just two men united by purpose and truth. Farmers from across the country came to see the new invention. Reporters called it the machine born from forgiveness. It was small enough to be affordable, yet powerful enough to change lives. Samuel's dream had finally become real, not stolen, not altered, but reborn. But beyond the success and attention, something deeper had begun to grow, something no camera could capture. The bond between Richard, Samuel, and Noah had turned into something like family. They met every morning at the factory, worked side by side, argued, laughed, and shared meals together. The bitterness of the past had melted into quiet respect. One day, Richard called a press conference to announce the machine's launch. Cameras flashed as he stood at the podium. But this time he wasn't the confident CEO everyone knew. He spoke humbly, his voice steady but full of emotion. Years ago, he began, "I built my empire on someone else's dream. I called it success. But today I understand that real success isn't measured by what you take. It's measured by what you give back." He paused, looking toward Samuel and Noah sitting in the front row. "This project doesn't belong to me. It belongs to the man who believed in creating for others. Not himself. Mr. Samuel Carter, my partner, my teacher, and the reason I rediscovered my humanity." The audience erupted in applause, not for the product but for the honesty behind those words. Cameras turned toward Samuel, who nodded modestly, his eyes glistening with quiet pride. After the event, a reporter approached Samuel. "Mr. Carter, how does it feel to finally get the recognition you deserve?" Samuel smiled gently. "It feels right, not because my name is known, but because my work now helps others. That's all I ever wanted." Meanwhile, Noah watched all of this from the sidelines, his heart swelling with admiration. To him, these two men weren't just inventors. They were proof that people could change. He had seen his father forgive the man who wronged him. He had seen that same man transform his guilt into something beautiful. And somewhere deep inside, Noah felt a fire spark. The desire to build his own path, one shaped by truth, not pride. That evening, after the celebration, Samuel and Richard sat under the stars behind the factory. The hum of the machines echoed softly in the distance. "Funny, isn't it?" Richard said with a faint smile. "We spent half our lives chasing power, and peace was waiting right here in the dirt." Samuel chuckled. "That's because peace doesn't live in towers, Richard. It lives where the work is honest." Richard nodded. "Do you ever wish things had gone differently?" Samuel took a slow breath. "If they had, we wouldn't be sitting here now." Silence fell between them, not uncomfortable but full of understanding. Just then, Noah walked over, holding a notebook filled with sketches. "Dad, Mr. Crane, I've been working on something," he said, excitement in his voice. He flipped it open to reveal blueprints for a smaller solar-powered farming tool. "It's not perfect yet, but it could help farmers in dry areas. I thought maybe this could be our next project." Richard and Samuel exchanged a look, both smiling proudly. Samuel placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "You've got the Carter heart," he said softly. Richard added, "And the Crane drive. That's a dangerous combination." They all laughed, but beneath the laughter was something sacred. A legacy was forming, one not built from money or fame, but from truth, forgiveness, and a promise to do better. As the night deepened, Richard looked out toward the horizon and whispered, "Maybe that's what redemption really means, not just making things right, but making sure the next generation starts clean." Samuel nodded, "And that's exactly what we've done." In that moment, the stars seemed brighter, as if the heavens themselves were acknowledging their journey. Two men who began as enemies and ended as brothers. Their story now carried forward by a child who had learned from both their hearts. The machine might have changed farming, but their forgiveness had changed the world. And as Noah looked up at the sky, he made a silent promise to carry their legacy forward not with power or pride, but with truth. Because some stories don't end when the work is done. Some stories become the work itself. Years later, the world had changed, and so had Noah Carter. The boy who once stood in a dusty workshop, fixing a broken machine, had grown into a man whose name was now whispered with respect across the country. His invention, a solar-powered farming system called the Unity Engine, was revolutionizing small farms. It was affordable, sustainable, and built from the lessons of two men, one who taught him wisdom and another who taught him redemption. On a bright morning, Noah stood before a large crowd gathered in the same field where his father once tilled the soil by hand. The air smelled of grass, machinery, oil, and memories. Reporters, engineers, and farmers from distant towns were present. A massive banner read, "The Carter Crane Agricultural Foundation, Building a Fair Future." As the cameras rolled, Noah took a deep breath and looked up at the sky. "My father used to say," he began, "that every seed carries two things, life and truth. And truth, like life, can take time to grow. Today we harvest that truth." The audience fell silent, their eyes fixed on him. Behind him stood two statues, one of Samuel Carter, his late father, holding a wrench and a book, the other of Richard Crane, wearing his signature hat and holding a blueprint. Both men were gone now, but their presence filled the field like a warm wind. Noah continued, "Years ago, this land saw pain, pride, and division. But it also saw forgiveness. My father and Mr. Crane showed me that redemption isn't about erasing the past. It's about building something better from it. They proved that even those who once stood on opposite sides can create something powerful when they stand together." He paused and smiled softly. "This new foundation will provide tools and education to young inventors, especially those who come from small towns and forgotten farms. Because genius doesn't live in cities alone. It lives wherever there is struggle, curiosity, and hope." The crowd erupted in applause. Some farmers wiped their eyes, others raised their hats in respect. For them, this wasn't just a speech. It was a promise fulfilled. After the ceremony, Noah walked alone to the old barn that still stood on the family land. The paint had peeled, the wood had aged, but it held echoes of the past. His father's laughter, the creak of tools, the faint smell of engine oil. He ran his fingers over the workbench where Samuel had spent nights designing his dreams. There, under a dusty cloth, lay a notebook, his father's final sketches. On the first page, written in faded ink, were the words, "One day truth will need no voice. It will simply live." Noah smiled, his eyes misty. "You were right, Dad," he whispered. "It lives now." He stepped outside, the evening light stretching long shadows across the golden fields. The crop swayed gently, powered by the same machines that had once been rejected by the world but were now saving it. Each hum of the engine was like a heartbeat, steady, alive, eternal. As he walked toward his truck, Noah stopped to see a young girl fixing a loose part on one of the small machines. She couldn't have been older than 12, her hands steady and confident. She looked up at him and said, "Mister, I think I can fix it." For a moment, Noah froze, the same words he once said years ago. Then he smiled warmly and replied, "I don't doubt that at all." He helped her tighten the last bolt, then handed her a small token, an old rusted wrench that once belonged to Samuel. "Keep this," he said. "It's from a man who taught me that hard work and truth never go out of style." As the sun dipped below the horizon, Noah climbed into his truck and looked back at the field one last time. The statues gleamed in the sunset, and for a brief moment he could almost see his father and Richard standing there, watching, proud, at peace. He turned the key, and the truck rumbled to life. "Rest easy," he murmured. "Your legacy is safe." The road ahead stretched endlessly, glowing beneath the last light of day. And as Noah drove forward, the wind carried a soft whisper through the fields. The voices of two men whose lessons had changed more than machines. They had changed the world because sometimes the greatest inventions aren't made of metal or wires. They're made of forgiveness, courage, and the power to begin again. Years rolled by like chapters in a book, and Noah Carter's name became a symbol of change, not just in farming but in humanity itself. People began to call him the bridge builder, the man who turned two enemies' story into a movement of unity and truth. Yet, despite all the awards, interviews, and invitations from powerful corporations, Noah remained the same humble soul who once stood barefoot beside a broken machine. One cool autumn morning, he returned to his hometown after a long trip abroad. The small community that had once been overlooked was now thriving. The dusty fields now shimmered with green, powered by his Unity engines. Every house had light, every child had education, and every farmer had dignity again. The world had changed because one man chose forgiveness over revenge, and another learned to bow before truth. As Noah walked through the marketplace, people greeted him with smiles. Some offered him apples, others small handmade gifts. But it wasn't fame that warmed his heart. It was the feeling of home. The laughter, the smell of earth, the rhythm of life. It all reminded him of his father, Samuel, and the long road that began with pain but ended in peace. He made his way to the town's new innovation center, a place dedicated to teaching young inventors how to dream and build. On the wall hung two portraits side by side, one of Samuel Carter and the other of Richard Crane. Beneath them, a plaque read, "They built more than machines. They built bridges." Noah stood silently before the portraits. The faces looked down at him, one calm and wise, the other stern but kind. "You both did it," he whispered. "You changed everything." Just then, a group of children ran up to him, eager to show their projects. One boy held a small mechanical bird that flapped its wings. Another showed a design for a self-watering crop pot. Their eyes sparkled with creativity and hope. Noah knelt beside them and said, "Do you know what makes a great inventor?" The kids looked puzzled. One of them guessed, "Having smart ideas?" Noah smiled. "No, it's having a good heart. Because a mind can build things, but only a heart can change lives." The children nodded, absorbing every word. For them, this wasn't just advice. It was a seed being planted in their young souls, one that would grow for generations. Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Noah visited his father's old grave under the oak tree. The wind whispered softly through the leaves. He placed a small gear on the stone, the same kind his father once used in his early designs. "I did my best, Dad," he said quietly. "And I think Mr. Crane would have been proud too." A tear rolled down his cheek, but it wasn't from sadness. It was peace, the kind that only comes when a person has fulfilled a destiny written long before they were born. He looked up at the fading light and thought of everything that had happened. The arrogance of the CEO, the pain of injustice, the power of forgiveness, and the rebirth of truth. All of it had led to this, a world better than the one before. Before leaving, he glanced at the horizon and whispered, "The story doesn't end with us, does it?" In that moment, a soft breeze passed through the fields, and it felt like an answer, a quiet yes carried by the earth itself. Noah smiled and walked back toward the town, his silhouette fading into the golden glow of dusk. Behind him, the fields hummed with life and the machines purred gently, not as tools of pride, but as symbols of harmony. The legacy of Samuel Carter and Richard Crane lived on. In every seed planted, every dream built, every child who dared to imagine a better tomorrow. Because sometimes, true stories don't fade into history. They grow roots, spread, and bloom into futures brighter than anyone ever dreamed. And so, in that little town that once held silence and pain, there now existed something stronger than fame: truth, love, and the courage to begin again.